So I'm very happy to be welcoming Agnes Callard, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Chicago. Agnes recently visited our seminar on interpretation that we hosted as part of the Institute for Philosophy and the New Humanities, an institute that's co-housed at the New School for Social Research and the University of Bonn, funded with a generous grant from the Udo Keller Foundation. And so in Agnes's visit, she came and gave a talk about what she called Socratic communication and some of the kind of threats to Socratic communication that she thought Socrates had strategies for avoiding and overcoming. So that's, I thought, a good starting point for us today to talk about what Socratic communication is and, what makes it go well when it goes well and what, what the dangers that it confronts are. But here's one way to kind of prompt you to say something more about that is I think of Socratic communication, your understanding, as involving the possibility of productive disagreement. It's a kind of exchange in which, people don't just disagree, but disagree in a way that is productive, that leads somewhere, or when it goes well, it leads somewhere. So I wondered, just what are your thoughts about what Socratic communication is and how does it relate to, or how does it center around productive disagreement?
Yeah, so I think that that's a good phrase, but in a way, it will help to use a slightly different phrase just to defamiliarize the territory. I would say refutational inquiry, which is just another way to say productive disagreement, except I put the noun and I reverse the noun and the adjective. So why I choose to do it that way is disagreement is often understood contingently, like we happen to disagree about something, so let us try to resolve our disagreement. But the thing Socrates is doing, you have to disagree, so you're in effect engineering or manufacturing a disagreement. And the reason why you're disagreeing is that it's only by disagreeing that it's possible to inquire into the thing you want to inquire into. So, and I don't think Socrates thinks this is just true of anything you might want to inquire into. I think he thinks it's true of a special subject matter, which is basically ethics. So he thinks that when it comes to ethical matters, we all already think that we have answers to these questions, to questions that in effect, we're making use of the answers to live our lives. So we need the answers. And so it's quite difficult to inquire into those topics. And the way that he developed to do it is that you take someone's answer, the answer they reflexively automatically give and think that they have ready to hand because they're using it, and you subject it to challenges, and that activity of refuting their answer is inquiry.
I love that. The first thing I think of is just social practices that we have at times engineered around the practice of trying to refute each other. You can think of scholastic disputations, or in our contemporary context, peer review. Do you think peer review, how does Socratic conversation in your sense relate to something like peer review?
So I think that not always that well. So I think in a peer review context, it becomes very tempting to be just producing reasons to reject something rather than refuting it on its own terms. That is, the peer reviewer is in a way engaged in a certain kind of solving a certain kind of problem in relation to a text, right? The problem the peer reviewer has to solve in relation to that text is the peer reviewer needs to produce another text that they're going to send to the editor that will justify a decision. And the decision is usually reject, and the Mostly peer reviewers think reject unless you have really good reason not to reject. And so most peer reviewers are searching for reasons to reject. And they're searching for reasons that in effect close the case, right? But when Socrates tries to refute someone, the refutation is always meant to open a conversation rather than to close one off. So I think that there really are there's a huge variety of social practices that have something of the refutational spirit. I think the criminal justice system, having a prosecutor and a lawyer for the prosecution, a lawyer for the defense, that has a kind of refutational spirit. I think just critical essays like, movie critics or whatever. So I think so to the extent that I just think someone being mean to you, that has a bit of the refutational spirit. And so to the extent that we broaden the umbrella of refutation to include those things, peer review would also get included. But I don't know that it's a much better case than any of those other ones that I just listed.
Okay, I like this. Let's talk about the criticism, because I think that is a good kind of case to bring up in this regard. One of the features you invoked is distinctive of this kind of productive Socratic conversation is, does it open up more topics for conversation as opposed to shut them down or close them off? Here's a maximally expansive conception of criticism that's maximally open in that sense. Nick Riegel, the philosopher of art, has a recent paper arguing for what he introduces the technical term of vibing to describe what he thinks the point of criticism is, where vibing is having an exchange with somebody else in which there's a kind of mutual appreciation of each other's individuality. And so, in sharing your experience of the artwork, what you're doing is kind of expressing who you are. And in appreciating someone else's critical take on an artwork, what you're appreciating is what's individual about them. And he thinks, that's what happens when conversations about art go well. And I wonder, that seems to me to push the kind of like opening up conversation almost to the point of absurdity. Like all we're doing there is just, opening up to each other.
Yeah.
And so we don't, the very idea that, art criticism would be kind of criticism seems lost. So I wonder, do you think if we're going to kind of carve out the unique space that Socratic conversation holds, as a kind of, I think of it as like, it's a kind of exemplar of healthy epistemic engagement with one another. And we think about, okay, what makes, that kind of engagement virtuous or go well, as opposed to vicious and going Bailey, involves a kind of openness. But do you think there are kind of limits to that openness? That's the point of my Nick Riegel vibing example, is to try to push you to say something about, do you think, there are limits to this, or should we be maximally open, or what does openness really mean here?
It means inquiry. So no, the Riegel example isn't such an example. That is, I would just describe that under the rubric of bonding, social bonding, right? And we can do social bonding around a variety of shared interests, and people who are elite and sophisticated often like to do it around art because it signals your like elite status. Like we're both really sophisticated people, so we can talk about art. And other, different populations, you might do it around sports or something, right? And that bonding is important. It's important because it's like social glue. But then the question is, what is the being bonded for, right? And bonding doesn't answer that question. What is the point of us enjoying one another's company? And I'm kind of hardcore Socratic, so I'm like, inquiry is the point. The point is that we can intellectually engage with one another. Everything else that we do to be unified is for the sake of intellectual engagement. I think of Socratic inquiry as not just like an exemplar, but kind of the only case, like kind of the exemplar. And I don't think we do it a lot. That is, I think of it as a kind of ideal that we typically fall short of, even in intellectual contexts, partly because we put a lot of mental effort into bonding, actually, even in intellectual contexts.
That's super interesting. But so I mean, here's an obvious thing you could worry about the Socratic case as the exemplar. It didn't seem to produce many results.
So should I list some of the results?
Great. Yes, please.
Okay. So here are some radical and counterintuitive conclusions that are the product of Socratic inquiry. A good man can't be harmed. Virtue is knowledge. There's no such thing as akrasia. Everyone desires the good. Doing injustice is worse than suffering it. Only a just man is able to willingly do unjust things. Those are just a few, and those are just from Socrates. We could then go over to Plato and talk about the theory of the forms, and then we could talk about like Aristotle's logic as having come out of Socrates's, sophistical kind of inquiries with sophists and like the Euthydemus. So I think is incredibly productive. I think it produced basically the field of philosophy, but locally it produced just a bunch of really counterintuitive ethical claims that are really well defended. As Socrates says in the Gorgias, they are tied down with arguments of iron and adamant. I think there is this conceit about the Socratic dialogues that they are aporetic, that they end in aporia, but it's not true. I mean, the Protagoras ends in aporia. It really does. Like it ends in a reversal of positions. Most of them do not end like that. The Gorgias ends with a list of claims that have been tied down with arguments of iron and adamant. You really can't get less aporetic than that. And in other dialogues, like the Meno, where there is aporia, it's not at the end of the dialogue. The end of the dialogue ends in a quite resolute way by drawing the distinction between knowledge and true belief and saying, here's a real distinction that we've learned as a result of this conversation. So I think of the dialogues as actually quite productive. I think the reason why they have the reputation of being aporetic is that it's very clear that the progress we've made is only partial, and we're not at the end of these inquiries. And a lot more work needs to be done, and people are very impatient. So they're like, wait, why didn't this dialogue end with the complete answer to everything? And it's like, well, it's one conversation, but I think that they are remarkably productive conversations.
Okay, this is great. I was expecting you to emphasize the process of engaging in conversation. I mean, do you think there's a way in which if we just say, oh, look, here's the results, and we give a list of them,
yeah,
we're missing out something important about the kind of life that Socrates is portraying in the dialogues?
So on the one hand, I want to be like, no, the entire point of inquiry is the things that you get. The point of a question is the answer. It's not like this fulfilling, rich process of doing inquisitive activity for its own sake. I think that's kind of messed up. People often have that approach where it's like, it's just the joy of the journey or something. Like for Socrates, it's very clear that there's stuff that he's looking for. He wants knowledge, and life without knowledge is unbearable. So on the one hand, I'm like, no, it's correct to emphasize the results. On the other hand, I think there is something to be said. So I think one thing Socrates tries to show you is that if you live the life he lives, which is the life that is kind of ruthlessly and methodically oriented after answers and doing whatever it takes to get at those answers, then you actually end up living well in each of the canonical areas of human activity where it is hard to live well. And those areas are politics, love, and the relationship to your own death. So in each of those three areas, Socrates says, I'm the expert. I'm the expert in politics, he says in the Gorgias. I'm the expert at love, he says in the Symposium and the Phaedrus. I'm the expert at being prepared for death, he says in the Phaedo. These are the traditional areas where human beings find themselves at sea. They find it unable to know how to conduct their lives in the arenas of love, death, and politics. And I do think one thing Plato is trying to show you is that the process is not the product. The process is the process. The product is the product. That's what we're after. But the process does give you guidance for how to be a human. I think that that's right.
Okay, I like this. So we have very much a kind of results and knowledge-based view of the kind of ethical significance of Socrates on your reading. Do you think there are any particularly distinctive challenges to conveying that knowledge? Or is that something we can just come out and say? Because this relates to a standard reading of the Platonic dialogues and the emphasis on the standard reading of Socratic irony as essential to, overcoming the difficulties and communicating the kind of ethical truths conveyed in them. I'm thinking here of, I think Kierkegaard gives the clearest account of this kind of way of reading Socratic dialogues, where if you came out and just tried to say those truths directly, you would be trying to do a kind of work yourself that the reader, the audience has to do for themselves. And so Kierkegaard thinks it's essential to this kind of communication that it be indirect, that it has to leave something for the audience to do for themselves, for it to have the transformative effect it's supposed to have. What's your attitude towards that standard reading of Socratic irony and indirect communication?
So I think Socrates literally just straight out comes out and says all the ethical truths that I just said. He says, a good man can't be harmed, virtue is knowledge. Everyone desires the good, doing justice is worse than suffering it. He does not think those things are hard to say. He doesn't think you have to cover them up. He doesn't think you have to convey them indirectly. He repeats them often. He'll say them multiple times when it's really important, like in the Crito, where he's trying to tell Crito, you can't get revenge. He says it 8 different ways. He's like, don't do bad stuff. Don't harm people. If somebody did something bad, still don't do a bad thing after that. Someone else doing a bad thing doesn't make your thing good. He repeats and repeats it. He's very flat-footed. He's very direct. He's the opposite of ironic. So I think that's just wrong. As a naive reader of the dialogues, he seems extremely direct. Socrates comes across as extremely direct with respect to the things that are important to him. But I think that when you say it's difficult to convey that knowledge, I mean, here we're getting to the issue, which is that Socrates doesn't think he has knowledge. The things that I listed, where those represent progress, philosophical progress, they still don't represent knowledge for Socrates. That is, they represent claims that are more stable than other claims, and they're more stable because they have been subjected to the process of elenchus over many conversations. That's genuine progress, right? But anytime I raise it for you, I'm not handing it to you as some bit of knowledge that I have. In effect, I'm raising it to you as opening it to be tested. And now you can challenge it, right? And then if you can't, find any way to challenge it, then in effect, we agree, and it becomes an agreement between us. It becomes a principle in accordance with which we live, but it's still open to be tested by other people. And, someone else, even a reader of the dialogue, can't really pick those things up unless they too are willing to basically do that same process of engaging with these claims and arguing over them and, putting the argument on a board, and here are the premises, here's the conclusion, does it follow? Let's argue about it. And so in that sense, I think there's something right about what Kierkegaard is saying, namely, you can't, even though the central claims are literally just flat out stated, you can't pull them out of the text and then own them unless you're willing to do something like the activity that Socrates is doing with his interlocutors.
Okay, good. So coming full circle back to the peer review example, there seems to be a kind of sincerity constraint. Obviously, Socrates himself often says, only say things that you truly believe. Do you think one of the things that is less than ideal about peer review is that it doesn't have that sincerity constraint?
So here's a really weird fact about the sincerity constraint. Everywhere it shows up in the dialogues, it shows up in maybe 3 dialogues, with one exception of the Crito. This isn't true of the Crito. It does show up in the Crito too. Socrates is the Crito. Don't speak against your belief. But in the other places where it shows up, like the Protagoras, the Republic, the sincerity constraint shows up, and then later, the insincerity escape hatch shows up. Okay, so where Protagoras, Socrates would be like, Protagoras, say what you believe. And then a little bit later, Protagoras what if I don't feel like saying what I believe? Socrates it's okay, say what you don't believe then. That's fine too, right? So it's actually really weird, a really spooky fact, right? About the dialogues is that Socrates gives the sincerity constraint. He then just lets up on it. And he lets up on it with all the people with whom he has asserted it, except the Crito. Okay, so that has to be explained. And so I think that the way that it's to be explained is that what the sincerity constraint really is somebody is trying to get out of the conversation somehow. say, by saying, well, let's just look at your beliefs, Socrates, or I'll go along with whatever, like kind of stepping away from it, like abstracting themselves from it, or Meno say, being like, why don't we examine what Gorgias thinks, right? So somebody is trying to not put themselves on the line and in a way to like not be part of the conversation. Someone's trying to withdraw and Socrates is pulling them back in and be like, no, say what you believe. But then at some later point, like they will, it'll sort of become clear that they're willing to stay in the conversation, but only insofar as like there's somehow this conceit that the views aren't theirs or something. And then Socrates would be like, yeah, if you want to stay in on those terms, I don't actually care. What I care is that you stay in the conversation. It just stands to reason that Socrates would not care too much about sincerity, in that he just doesn't think anyone knows what they think. Right. He thinks everyone's beliefs waver constantly. So what is the big prize with sincerity? I mean, somebody will say P and then say not P, and like, which is the sincere one, right? That's his whole thing, is exposing that. So I view the sincerity, the say what you believe rule, as more like Socrates employing a variety of strategies to keep the person in the conversation and to speak in such a way as to be open, such that what Socrates says back to them speaks to them and opens them to refutation. Peer review, I think that there's like a lot of forms, if we go outside the submitting a paper to a journal context. I mean, I was just right before this, I was in another Zoom where I was like a panel discussion, somebody gave a talk and then a couple of us gave comments, right? And that's a kind of peer review. I'm like, here's a problem with your talk. And then like he responded to me and then I responded back, and, it can only go a certain amount because it was like, but that's a kind of peer review that I think is much closer to something that's Socratic, because there was a chance for back and forth. With much peer review, there is no chance for that. And there's the knowledge in advance that there won't be any chance for that. And that knowledge really shapes how the peer review takes place. It's like much more like the processing of a data item or something than it is like a real critique, a lot of times anyway.
Okay, this is really interesting. I mean, one I think misreading you could have of what you're saying is, oh, this Socratic conversation, it gives us like an impossibly high standard. Like maybe, we could treat Socrates as, the one actual example of this, but it's just been downhill since then.
Yeah.
And it's, it's an exemplar, but an exemplar the rest of us can't hope to achieve or participate in.
Yeah.
And at your talk at the Institute, you gave a really charming anecdote about your own earlier attempt in life to try to, follow the lead of Socrates. I wonder if we could talk about that and then talk about the kind of story since then, if you feel like you've been more successful since then at, living up to the Socratic model.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think even if it was an impossibly high standard, first, let's start with that, is like, so what, right? I mean, that is just try to meet it. I mean, Jesus says, be ye therefore perfect. And it's like, that's a pretty high standard, but a lot of people just try to do that. It could well be, I mean, the best we have of Socrates is Plato. And it could well be that what we have has really been idealized through a Platonic lens, such that we have like a polished up version, right? A better version than an actual person. Like it's clearly inspired by an extraordinary actual person, but it could well be that Plato in effect is so attuned to the ideal in Socrates that he's just better at presenting that than Socrates would if we had video of Socrates' conversations or something. So I'm open to the thought that it's kind of that what we have in the dialogues is kind of ideal. But so yeah, I think that's partly why we find it so inspiring, is because it's such a kind of like in some sense plausible ideal to imitate. And so I did try to imitate it when I was an undergraduate. I wanted to be Socrates, so I went to the Art Institute, to the steps in front of the Art Institute, because I was an undergrad at the University of Chicago, and I asked people Socratic questions. I mean, at first I asked them their permission. I'm like, can I have a philosophy conversation with you? And they would say yes. And then I would say, like, what's the meaning of life, or what is art, or what is courage? And it did not go well. They even though they said they wanted to have philosophy conversations with me, they clearly actually didn't want to have those conversations. Maybe they just didn't want to tell me that they didn't want to have them. And I was clearly very bad at putting them at ease and at making it appear to them that I really wanted to inquire into this thing with them. And maybe I didn't. That is, maybe they were really picking up on the fact that I was kind of playing Socrates. It's kind of play acting, right? In the symposium, you have, I think it's either, I can't remember, this Aristodemus or Apollodorus, who walks around barefoot because Socrates was barefoot. So he has like this cult of Socrates and people just imitating him, right? So I was like being in the cult of Socrates, imitating him, and people, this was be obvious to people, and they were like, what are you doing? This is just very weird. And I just think, you know, I'm kind of constantly trying to make the imitation more like the reality, where the reality is the reality of the ideal. It might not be the reality of the actual historical Socrates, right? But I guess to me, that's not, like, somehow I feel like the idea of it's an impossibly high standard is meant to, it's meant to have the rhetorical effect of like, so give up or don't even try or something. And it's like, why would you think that? Like, I mean, I suppose you might think that if you thought there's some other way to have a good life. And so it's pretty significant, you know, if you buy Socrates' thought that the unexamined life is not worth living, it's like, it's zero, right? Then you can't really opt out of this and just do some other thing that's also worthwhile if there's nothing else that's worthwhile. So in a way, the stakes are kind of lowered by the thought that there are no other options. This is your only other option. This is your only option for worth, and you're probably going to fail at it, which sucks. But like, there's no reason not to try. You might as well try and have the thing that's worthwhile.
Oh, that's great. What else? So when it has gone better since then, what do you think, you know, the difference that made a difference was?
I think that I think there's like a lot of different things that make a difference. So I think people have different strengths. And for me, I am the best at answering questions once I have said something, like at being examined on a view that I have presented. I am most able to sustain a Socratic spirit in that context. And like, for instance, when I'm the questioner, right? So I run an event series where I'm asking people questions, and I'm just not nearly as good at asking them as at being asked them, which corresponds to something Socrates says, which is like, sorry, actually, no, so it doesn't correspond to something Socrates says. I think Socrates thinks that in a way the speakers have the more difficult job, but even if it's more difficult to be asked questions because you have to have the view, and so that's why he's so appreciative of it, nonetheless, it's more like idiosyncratic and unusual to be able to do the thing Socrates does, which is to ask the questions. And I'm just less good at that. And so, which isn't to say I still keep trying, because I want to get good at it. But the point is that it's almost like if I want my entry point is more that of being asked questions than of asking them. And teaching is like that. Teaching is just an opportunity to be asked questions by my students, I feel like. And I think those inquiries can be quite productive. And it's just very typical that in class, I'll find myself saying something that I didn't quite know that I thought, and saying it in exactly the perfect way, because somebody asked me the right question. And, you know, and the right question was usually a challenge to something I had just said. So I see those as inquiries. I have found, you know, something that I have found from experience is that it is quite difficult to do this activity without institutional support. So like, a classroom is like magic. Things can happen in a classroom that will not happen outside the classroom. And so you're at the steps of the Art Institute. Forget the steps of the Art Institute. You're at a dinner after a talk, okay? And the talk was intellectual, and the Q&A, this happened in at the event that we went to, the Q&A is intellectual, right? And then everybody goes to the dinner, and it's the same people. And these are all intellectuals. They're all philosophers. In fact, maybe the people who go to the dinner are selected for their special investment and expertise and whatever. And what is the dinner conversation? maybe elevated intellectual gossip or something. It's not an inquiry. The inquiry just falls apart. People are unable to sustain it. And so what I found is that like the thing that Nick is talking about, vibing, I mean, that's the gravitational pull of doing vibing is really strong. People will do that if left to their own devices, which is to say, basically, if outside of a classroom, they will do, there's a lot of pressure to do vibing. And the bigger the group is, the more the pressure is. So maybe with one person, if you can be talking to one person, maybe you can get over the vibing. But so that's something I've learned that I was like naive. I didn't think it mattered whether you were in a classroom or on the steps of the Art Institute. But in fact, it really does matter like what physical space you're in.
I have a couple of different kind of thoughts in relation to this. But the first is just, do you think the Platonic dialogues give us depictions of interlocutors who are exemplary in this sense? So not in terms of this, the depictions of Socratic questioning, but in terms of the interlocutors' responses. And I think what you're really getting at is their willingness to continue the conversation, to continue the inquiry, and in a directed, focused way. Do you think the Platonic dialogues give us depictions of exemplary interlocutors in that sense?
So supposedly, people always cite Theaetetus in the Theaetetus because like it's long and like he seems nice or something and he gets praised. I'm not so impressed by his contributions in that dialogue. I feel like if you just compare like Callicles or Thrasymachus, I mean, there's just it's not just the emotional fireworks. It's like Callicles has a whole theory of pleasure, right, that then can be examined, and he is kind of countercultural. So I guess or I mean, really, and sorry, instead of Thrasymachus, I should say Glaucon and Adeimantus. I mean, Glaucon and Adeimantus take the view of Thrasymachus and they really try to like, polish it up into a theory that can then be carefully examined. I think, I guess I would say that maybe Plato is presenting Glaucon and Adeimantus as like pretty ideal interlocutors.
There's a lot of yes, Socrates, you're right, Socrates, with them.
Oh, absolutely. So that's going to be everywhere. And, I think that's meant in part, like, if Socrates is good at what he's doing, he's going to induce a lot of yes, Socrateses, right? Because he's going to be saying things that he expects the other person to agree to. He, like, in effect, the way Socratic, it works by agreement, right? And so, and if you have tons of these conversations with people, if you spend your whole life having them, you get pretty good at predicting what they're going to agree to and at saying those things. And, if you're Plato, it is possible to sort of end up in a kind of question begging situation where you end up making someone agree to something that nobody would agree to just to make Socrates look good or something. But I actually think Plato was like pretty careful about not doing that and about having people like Callicles and Polus and Gorgias resist Socrates whenever in any way that it's possible to do so, while at the same time showing off that Socrates' talent was precisely to secure the kind of grudging agreement that you get in the last stretch of the Gorgias.
Isn't it? Yeah, I mean, don't we want, in a sense, more disagreement? I mean, it's the disagreement that's pushing the conversation forward. It's when
could there be more disagreement than there is between Callicles and Socrates? I mean,
but that's why that's the example. That's why I think you could think that's an exemplary case because it has so much more disagreement than the sycophantish-like behavior we see other times, where he doesn't even feel like a conversation; it just feels like Socrates lecturing people.
But Callicles says yes, Socrates, just as much as anybody else. I mean, so it's a massive disagreement, but the way that disagreement proceeds is by Socrates finding things they can both agree to. And so, like, I don't think okay, take the Laches, right? Where Nicias is basically presenting Socrates' own view. Okay, he tells him, My definition of courage, I think I've heard you say this, Socrates, is courage is knowledge. Do you like that one? And Socrates like tries to refute it and basically shows Nicias that he doesn't have any way of distinguishing between courage and the other virtues, right? If all of virtue is going to be knowledge. So so I think even when, and if you take dialogues with like the kind of the like young and flexible interlocutors like Charmides or Lysis, right, or Alcibiades, first Alcibiades, I think that those are, it's like, it's very clear that Socrates's style and his choice of questions and where the conversation goes is inflected by the person that he's talking to. And, and he's pushing them. He's pushing all of those people out of their comfort zones, even when they're inclined to be very much in agreement with him. Or Crito, I mean, the Crito is maybe the most extreme case. Crito's probably like his best buddy. And, he's got to convince his best friend to let him die. And that's what the Crito is. So I think there's tons of disagreement in all of these texts. And yet, like, the way that those disagreements are conducted is through a series of little micro agreements.
Okay, great. I mean, here's my final question. I guess it's to introduce just, one more kind of factor in making Socratic conversation possible. It's to think about the role of trust in between the interlocutors in the conversation, because one way you could take some of the things I've heard you say about when Socratic conversation breaks down is to say it breaks down because the interlocutors don't trust Socrates. And I think you think, the standard reading of Socratic irony comes out of that kind of distrust. They don't really believe that he's doing or trying to do what he says he is. And I think you feel like that's probably also what happened with your youthful adventure at the Art Institute. The people that you tried to have conversations with didn't really trust that you were at all serious or sincere in what you were saying you were doing. And so I wonder, there's the two sides of this question. There's what provokes distrust, which I think is an interesting question in itself, and then what can produce trust, or how is trust possible in these kind of they're combative encounters too. They're refutational, which you could think almost inherently produces a kind of distrust. So I'm wondering what produces distrust, and how does Socrates, when he does overcome that distrust, overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I happen to at the moment be rereading The Idiot, which is, this Dostoevsky novel about this guy, Prince Mishkin, who is able to induce a lot of trust in other people sort of immediately, right? People who want to distrust him. Like where it would appear like he's in a situation where the natural reading would be he's trying to get money out of you, he's trying to get you to put him up for the night, he's trying to like kind of fake a familial connection that isn't there. Or those are that's the natural readings that the characters have of the situation when it starts out, and then he kind of wins them over. And it's the story of this character, and I find it to be a very Russian story because Russians are incredibly suspicious. It's one of the it's like their national character is that of, maybe because of their political history or whatever. And of course, most of Dostoevsky characters give other people very good reason to be suspicious, right? But here's this guy who he just makes it clear there's no reason to be suspicious of him. And it just kind of works. And I sort of think Socrates was a little bit like that, where now you might say, but look, there's always people who distrust Socrates. And it's like, yes, but they do a lot of trusting of him too. That is, it's kind of like, well, they killed Socrates, but before they killed him, they didn't kill him for a really long time, and they just let him get away with it. And like, in the Gorgias, I mean, the Gorgias is super long, right? It's like, I don't know, 80 pages or something before it all falls apart. The Protagoras is pretty long too. All of that length, that's all trust. That's all people not walking away, right? And And I think that he didn't use any special trick. I think that he did the same thing that Prince Michigan does, which is just actually want to inquire into the question and just be doing that all the time, and be a kind of resolutely unsuspicious himself. Like, he's very charitable in his interpretations of other people. He always just thinks they're trying to help him, like with Callicles, like, I'm so lucky I ran into you. And I think that's not fake. I think it's like, it falls out of his view that everyone desires the good. And all these people are trying to do in like arguing against him, and even in suspecting him, all they're trying to do is help him. Maybe they fear him, so they're trying to run away, but that would be it. They're either trying to help him or they are trying to help themselves. And I think that, I think he actually does, in some ways, very little managing of the people that he talks to. So it's like there are these moments where, like, there's a moment in an early conversation where Prince Michigan is just ready to walk away because the other person has suspicions of him. And then the other person just like, you know what? No. And it's very surprising. He kind of turns around on him. And I think that happens to Socrates too, where Socrates, and at a number of points in the conversation, Socrates like, do you want to continue? Or he's ready to walk away. He's not going to like try to trick or coerce the person into remaining in the conversation. He wants to inquire with people, and he tries to make that as clear as possible. And it is threatening, and he understands that it's threatening to them. And, you know, he does what he can to try to say, this is a good thing that I'm doing to you. Like in the Meno, where he does it to Meno's like, you made me numb, you made me unable to speak. And Socrates is like, give me your slave boy, let me do it to him, and you watch. Did I hurt him? No, right? So he, you know, he thinks people just don't understand, right? Which is true. It's really correct, because it's like, here's the first guy kind of engaging in a certain kind of intellectual activity that's not for the sake of the law course. It's not for the sake of looking good. It's not for the sake of bullying someone. It's not to create a debate. It's not as a spectacle. It's not because you want to attract students. It's not like inside of a tragedy. It's not. So like, there's all these contexts of where they're used to how speeches work and what the norms are. And he's saying, no, there's different norms here. And so he's understanding about the fact that if you're the guy who's making up a new game, you have to be patient with people misunderstanding the game that you're playing. And so he kind of systematically interprets them that way. Even Anytus in Vino, right, who's going to go and accuse him, you know, he treats the same way.
Here's my only thought, or my first thought, I guess, in response to that is, but we have other cases where if we kind of take that of just wanting to know, if we think that that's all that, you know, is involved for it to go well. Francie Russell has an amazing reading of Chinatown, the movie, where she reads it as being about a kind of, you know, reductio of that kind of view, where the central character, Jack Nicholson's character, is a private eye who just wants to know. He just wants to get to the bottom of what's really going on. And Russell thinks what explains why everything goes so horribly wrong at the end of the movie is that that's all that Jack Nicholson's character wants. And what's missing is acknowledgement. What's missing is this other part of our relationship to others, which doesn't just go through wanting to know. Do you think there's room for that in your reading of Socrates, or is Socrates a kind of, you know, response to that? I know he just got the wrong kind of desire to know, or, you know, knowing is enough to get us to the right result.
Yeah, I guess so I think he thinks knowing it's knowing the right things. I mean, the thing you're trying to know is how to live, right? So, you know, if what you want to know is who committed a crime or whatever, that's not good enough. And Socrates, in fact, in the Phaedo says, like, look, there's people around me, they want to know a bunch of irrelevant stuff, like how, you know, how something grows when food is added to it or whatever. And I don't care about that stuff. I want to know like how to live. So you have to be asking the right questions. But I think, you know, what's so great about acknowledgement? I mean, that is, I see acknowledgement as just one word, another word we use for bonding, right? So we had vibing, and you know, being together, bonding, and like, what's good about that? Like, I think you can pursue that in a really stultifying and kind of conformist and coercive way, where like you're constantly having to acknowledge each other and you're not ever doing anything or getting anything done. So I see acknowledgement as having kind of instrumental value in making the group, which could just be two people, able to work together towards some shared end. And I would say we need to have some conception of what those ends could be. And I think inquiry is like a pretty good one. So yeah, but I think if it was just any old kind of knowing, then it would be curiosity, right? So there's like the vice of curiosity. It was originally a vice. I mean, in Augustine, in Apuleius, the word curiositas is a negative word for a vice. And you can see it even in the Republic. There's obviously no Latin word curiositas in the Republic, but there is Leontius wanting to look, right? So there's stuff where you want to know and it's not good for you. And that's absolutely a possibility. And in the ancient world, much more appreciated that danger actually than we do, where for us, the word curiosity is just like praise. People are constantly trying to show that, well, I'm just curious, like as though that were a good thing, right? So I think Socrates was absolutely sensitive to that worry, but I think that the kind of inquiries that he was pursuing are kind of immune to it.
I love that. The vice of curiosity is a good ending point. Thank you so much, Agnes. This was wonderful to talk. So I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again sometime soon.
Me too. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.